So far, that's the only standing ovation we've had on an entrance. And I know it's for your pin. What's the pin? Explain the brooch.
The pin is by Native Americans, the Zunis, that are in New Mexico. And I think it's kind of fun to show our art from America. And when we were doing cultural diplomacy when I was in office, when we had an event at the White House, I wore one of my Native American pins, and I think it's a good thing to celebrate our culture.
You may not know this, but I think someday when there's a museum of cultural diplomacy, near here, safe, some will build it near here, right? Later, okay. But there should be a portion of it devoted to your brooches.
Well, I'll tell you what's happened in Washington. The State Department has decided to have a museum of diplomacy, and they've just opened it up. And I do have a collection of pins that has been traveling around the United States. They are the ones that I wore when I was Secretary of State. And it makes it possible for me to explain that foreign policy doesn't have to be so foreign, that there are all kinds of great stories. And so that collection has gone around the United States. It's been at the presidential libraries. At the moment, it's at the Reagan Library and in museums. And I've decided to give it ultimately to the museum that's attached to the State Department. So I hope people go and visit that.
Well, that's fantastic. And, you know, it may sound like a small thing, but it really is an illustration of this idea of cultural diplomacy, because each one has meaning. People come up to you, they connect. It means something to them. And all of a sudden, you're having a human conversation instead of reading talking points.
Absolutely. And people, it's a wonderful way for people just to feel that it's comfortable to come up and connect. So that's what I've been doing, and happy to do that here.
Well, your roots with cultural diplomacy go back and actually tie to your origins in Czechoslovakia. You were born in Czechoslovakia, right? And you started doing work in cultural diplomacy back then. And maybe you could talk about sort of your view of the origins, particularly around the idea of jazz. We have a lot of musicians here. And so, you know, cultural diplomacy, you know, it sounds kind of fancy and one of those terms that you know, can be kind of abstract and high level, but it's not that. It's actually human, and maybe just talk a little bit about the origins, maybe of jazz diplomacy.
Well, I do think, as we said last night, it is a way for us to have a language that we all understand, and I think it is a link in so many different ways. So let me just say, I was born in Czechoslovakia, and Czechoslovakia always had, the modern Czechoslovakia, a relationship with the United States. It was started after World War I. But for instance, I grew up with the New World Symphony, Dvořák, and talking about the connection of music with America, and all that was very much a part of what I grew up with. So I have loved jazz for my whole life, and what was interesting, during the Cold War, there was no question that jazz was an American idiom that was able to penetrate all kinds of places, and as you mentioned, Louis Armstrong, and a lot of aspects that people completely related to. So what happened during the Cold War in Czechoslovakia, there actually was something called the jazz section, which in fact were musicians that played jazz. But they also then developed a political angle, and they were part of a dissident group. So I used to go and visit during the Cold War, and what happened was all of a sudden I was told by the political officer, the American at our embassy there, that I needed to go and visit the jazz section's headquarters. And literally, this is what happened. They said to me, "You will meet a man at a square in Prague by a big gate. He will be wearing a raincoat. And he will approach you and say, 'Come with me.' So go with him." So we then get in the Prague metro, and he actually said to me, "We have to stand really close so people think we're lovers." I had never seen this person. So anyway, we end up
This is diplomacy, ladies and gentlemen.
We end up at the headquarters of the jazz section, where in fact they had their most prized possessions were the Rolling Stones magazine and various American things. And they saw themselves as a group that could talk about freedom and music. And so what happened is they didn't have very much money, so I gave them whatever I had with me, and we made out made a plan that, in fact, when I got back to the U.S., I would try to send them money, but not large amounts till we were really sure that it worked. So I sent $100, and I get a message back saying, I got your 100 wishes, which I think probably somebody could figure out what we were doing. But then when I went back to Prague at another time and met some other dissidents, they weren't sure that the main guy in the raincoat was somebody that they could trust, but nevertheless. But the jazz was really a symbol of America. And then Václav Havel was somebody who loved music and made it a very big point of supporting musicians, the Plastic People of the Universe, and a number of different musical aspects. And it was their way of really expressing freedom. And so he was always a great supporter. He loved Lou Reed. And when Václav Havel came to the United States, we would go from jazz club to jazz club.
But didn't you do like a dinner for Václav Havel in the White House with Lou Reed?
Lou Reed was the main entertainment because that's what Václav Havel wanted. And so that was
really as the vibe. You can just see the Trump White House doing the same thing. Lou, if Lou Reed weren't dead, it would kill him. But
no, it really was very much a symbol. And then what really did by the way, cultural diplomacy, we've been talking about jazz, but Václav Havel was a playwright, and he expressed himself in ways through plays that were translated and that really did also make an impact as they went around in terms of his thoughts. So I think cultural diplomacy is, as you pointed out last night, is not just kind of secondary tool. It is something that really does link us in so many ways. And I was so proud to be able to kind of make it more of a part of our diplomatic toolbox in many ways of having the possibility of connecting with countries, not just through music, but exchange of artists. Then our embassies, as you know, are really great places to display American art.
Well, that's a whole program, right?
It's a program called Art and Embassies Program. So it's a very important part of our diplomacy.
And it's probably unfair to pick on different White Houses that do it in different ways. Some presidents play golf.
Yeah.
And some presidents play golf all the time. But you're favor of that? No. Oh, okay. I see it.
Well, I worked for a president who played an instrument, the saxophone.
Exactly. That's what I was going to get. I was going to get to that.
It was very much a part of Bill Clinton's life. So, and again, I always love to connect the dots. What happened was that we were talking about how we were going to expand NATO, and that began with something called Partnership for Peace that General Shalikashvili, chairman of the Joint Chiefs at the time, went around to explain to the countries in Central and Eastern Europe. By the way, we went to so many countries in 36 hours that we were afraid that we would get confused about where we were. So we decided that when we got off the plane, we would just say, we're so happy to be in your country to see your leader. But anyway, we...
This is, by the way, in Washington, you learn these tricks. For example, you never say, nice to meet you.
No, nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
It's
right.
a very important tip, because
right.
it might insult somebody if you'd actually met
No,
them.
and actually, whenever I've made a mistake to say nice to meet you, people will say, I already met you 10 years ago, don't you remember? But I do think the thing that happened, so Prague was the final stop, and President Clinton was going to come, and I had met Václav Havel before. What had happened was that President Clinton's mother had just died, and so the advance team from the White House had kind of put the kibosh on what Václav Havel wanted to do, which was to give a saxophone to President Clinton and go to a jazz club. And that they had said no way because he was in mourning. And I kind of doubted, that was necessarily what the president had said. So I went to pick him up in Brussels and bring him to Prague. And I had made a deal with Havel. If I explained it to President Clinton and he said, fine, go ahead with it, when we got off the plane and Havel gave me a big hug, I would tell him yes or no on the plane. So President Clinton said, of course I want to do that. So we get off the plane, and I say to Havel, we're a go. And so we had the best time. We walked across Charles Bridge. We went to a jazz club. They gave President Clinton a saxophone. He played My Funny Valentine. Then he sat down and he said, Madeleine, you have no idea how hard it is to play a brand new saxophone. But everybody gave him saxophones wherever, and it was his thing. And he loved to play. And one more story on that. When we went to Moscow.
I don't think these people will sit here all day listening to these stories.
But one of the things, when we went to Moscow for a summit, President Putin, who is stiff as a board, decided that he
He's
would
not a
he's
jazz
not
guy.
exactly,
No.
no. But he did manage to pull together a jazz concert in Moscow from some people that, much older, frankly, who really loved jazz, and President Clinton's there jiving, and Putin is sitting there like that. But it was really, it's known for what it is, American music that President of the United States loved beyond anything.
Well, it's taken many forms, right? You had ping pong diplomacy, sports is part of cultural diplomacy. The Russians would send the Bolshoi around or others.
No, it makes a big difference, I think.
Yeah, no, and which worked until people defected and so forth. The question, I guess, turns us to now is, what are the areas of the world where it can make a difference? One of the ones that strikes me is we have a tension between the Islamic world and the West. It's fueled by right-wing ideologues and nationalists and by ignorance. But it seems to me that this is an area where there might be an opportunity as people use the arts to humanize and understand and to start to build bridges to do more than we're doing. I don't know, what's your view on that?
Well, I definitely agree. I think, by the way, one of the things in the United States, we believe in a separation of church and state. And so when I was the first Secretary of State to put Muslim holidays on the official calendar. And we began to have iftar dinners and began to understand what Islam was about. And at the same time, I had a feeling that our diplomats didn't fully understand how religion affects foreign policy. So I wrote a book, and it's called The Mighty and the Almighty, about the role of religion in foreign policy. And so I thought that our diplomats, in addition to learning the language and history, needed to study the religious background of different countries. And that is what's actually happening now. But I also do think that there are so many aspects of religion that have to do with culture, that really express the feelings of the people, either through song or through art or dancing in a number of ways. And I think that we need to explore our commonality in that regard also.
What's your view of these cultural divides? I mean, you see it in Europe, you see it in the United States, you see tensions. Is this a momentary thing? Is it something you think is going to get worse? Is it something you think needs to be ratcheted up as a priority?
Well, I think the following thing is that we have kind of, political scientists are supposed to talk in mega trends, but there really are, I think, two of them that have an opposite side to them or a downside to them. Globalization. We all talk about globalization, and it's an attempt at openness and understanding each other, but it does have a downside to it because in so many ways it's faceless, and people don't know where they belong in it. So people begin to group by identity, and there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, we all want to know who we are, whether it's linguistic or ethnic or religious. The only problem is that if my identity hates your identity and describes itself in terms of dislike for the other, then it's very dangerous. And patriotism is one thing, but hyper-nationalism is very, very dangerous. And we're seeing that in a number of places because when the economy is not going well or something, you decide to blame somebody else. I am very troubled, let's just take Europe, for instance, where two world wars of major proportions where lots of people died, but the countries in Central and Eastern Europe, for instance, came out of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and were created on the basis of nationality. I was born in Czechoslovakia. That came in 1918. And so people hoped that the European Union would take care of that, but it's faceless. A bunch of bureaucrats in Brussels that are not related to the people in any way. So that all of a sudden has become an identity. And I'm very troubled when the Hungarians, for instance, decide that they don't want to deal with anybody that's not Christian. It's crazy because it doesn't make any sense. So that's the downside of it. Technology is the other great mega trend that has connected everybody. And so it's always interesting to talk about the Kenyan woman farmer who doesn't have to walk miles to pay her bills. She can do it over a mobile phone. But what has also happened is it's disaggregated voices, and people live in their own little worlds, talking on their telephones, and getting information only from the people they already agree with. And so that's become a problem in terms of how you deal with institutions. So there are things that I think are making things worse, frankly. And the question is how we get out of this phase and still have our identities without deciding that we don't want to talk to the people next door. And I think that there are those who are exacerbating it, who are playing off of it, as some of the demagogue politicians who really do think that it's better to dislike anybody that doesn't look exactly like them. And so I think we have to push against that. I am often asked if I'm an optimist or a pessimist. I'm an optimist who worries a lot. And so I do think that we have to push against that.
Well, you know, sometimes I describe the changes that you're talking about as a fast change and a slow change. And the fast change, and particularly a number of countries face this, the fast change is technological change, where the world is connecting extremely rapidly. That's got some very positive effects, as you've talked about. It's also got some potential for backlash. The slow change is demographic change, aging of societies, and so forth. In the United States, it's going to take a society that was primarily dominated by a kind of white, Christian male, sort of view for a couple of hundred years, and by 2020, the majority of voting age Americans will be either Asian, Latino, or African American. In other words, the minority will be the majority. By 2043, the majority of people in the United States will be Asian, Latino, or African American, which means that the cultural makeup of the country is going to be dramatically different from what the world is used to. And I just flag this because it suggests to me culture is not immovable. Culture changes. Cultural diplomacy and the cultural tensions between countries evolve as these other factors come into play. But sometimes it seems to me that political leaders around the world, diplomats, are unprepared to deal with these changes.
I think that's absolutely true. And not only unprepared, but then kind of use them for their own purposes. And that's what I find very troublesome, of kind of working. Look, societies are complicated in so many ways, and there was a social contract initially in which the deal was that people gave up some part of their individual rights in order to be protected by the state. In many ways, that social contract is broken down in a lot of places because of economic crises. And if there's a problem, then you always try to blame somebody else. And if you're a demagogic politician, you take advantage of it. What I think, it's obvious, I'm a naturalized American. And I became a citizen when I was in college. And one of the things that I love to do more than anything is go to naturalization ceremonies. Because we were refugees. We were refugees twice. We were refugees in England during World War II, and then when we came to the United States. And so I can't swear people in because I'm not an officer of the law, but I can give people their naturalization certificates. And so I hand it out, then I hear this man saying, "Can you believe I'm a refugee, and I got my naturalization certificate from the Secretary of State?" And I said, "Can you believe that a refugee is Secretary of State?" And that is what America has been about, and I hope that the diversity is something that comes through.
Well, diversity is an asset in a global society. Here in the UAE, Dubai and Abu Dhabi are places that are 85, 90% expat. Yeah. They are, perhaps the most cosmopolitan places on the planet in that regard because they have that kind of balance. And it seems like the world is developing that way. Because, Singapore, Shanghai, Hong Kong, there are these hubs that are much farther ahead on globalization than the rest of societies around them. And it creates a tension. US, you have red and blue states and so forth. But it seems to me you can look at those places to see where the world is going.
I hope so, because that's where the resource are the people. It's the brains and interaction of the people in those particular hubs. It's nice to have oil, but having smart people that relate to each other, I think, is where the future is.
Well, I think here that's, I mean,
Yep.
that's been a strategy from the beginning. It was, let's set some of this oil money aside. Let's invest it in something different. Let's invest it in education from the very beginning. And you now have a country here that I think, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the oil and gas as a percentage of GDP is under 30%, and it's heading to under 20%, because of a deliberate intention to diversify and focus on thought leadership and human resources rather than other natural resources.
Very important, which is why it's thriving and fun to come here.
It is fun to come here.
Yeah.
Is anybody disagree with? No disagreement with that. Thank you.
By the way, David, I think what you're doing here with this summit is fantastic, and I hope is very much the beginning of movement in all of this, because it does prove that we have so much in common and can have really deep conversations and intellectually respect each other.
Well, I thank you. And I think that is the intention behind it. And I think there are all sorts of new challenges that arise. I was in China a couple of weeks ago, and you really get a sense of vibrance and growth. And one of the things that's always been interesting to me is that as you watch the economic center of gravity shift in the world, the intellectual center of gravity shifts with it. And there's been a period where the U.S. was the economic center of gravity, and we led in some of these other areas, which led to accusations of cultural imperialism and so forth, and Hollywood and music and so forth played a role in that. But it seems like that may change. It seems like as the economic center of gravity crosses the Pacific, we may see new nations leading in that mix. And it's not to say the era of the U.S. is over, but it does suggest to me that a more diverse sort of cultural landscape and hierarchy in the world is around the corner. Do you think that's right?
I do. I think that we learn from each other, and I now many times use the word respect in terms of each other's historical background, differences, and learning from each other, and deciding that we don't have to be a unipolar world. Americans don't like the word multilateralism. It has too many syllables and ends in ism, but basically it means partnerships and understanding each other. And the cultural route, I think, is one of the best ones, because it's not threatening. I mean, it's a way of enjoyment and understanding and meeting people through a language that they want to express themselves in.
Well, and as Carla said the other day, the language of emotions is a universal language. This is what connects us in a human way, and the arts enable us to do that. Would you take one or two questions from the audience?
Yes.
All right. Who in the audience? You didn't think I could catch it? That's.
Hi, good morning.
Identify yourself.
My name is Kola Tubosu. I'm from Nigeria. Thank you very much for your work. I have been a grantee of the Fulbright program, which I think continues the idea of cultural diplomacy and helps countries understand themselves. The program I went with was the FLTA program, which took students from Nigeria, from different parts of the world, to go to the US to teach their language to American students. And it was a great idea. I enjoyed the program very much. I remember in 2009 when I went, that Afghanistan, I think, was the first time they were participating in the program, in the FLTA program at the time. And it was billed as one of the impressive steps that has been taken to help the US understand that part of the world. But over the last couple of years, because of the shift in political winds in the US, especially the ban on people from other parts of the world coming to America, I've been wondering about the effect of that on understanding each other around the world. I mean, I know that some parts of the world have been banned from coming to America. I don't know if it affects the Fulbright program. And also the cuts in in funding for this kind of program. So how are you helping? How do you think you can help to?
I have to say, I'm very glad you asked that. I am very worried exactly about what you're talking about. I teach at Georgetown University, and what has been very good is always having students from different countries, the capability of working with them in a number of ways, and then it develops a network of people that then are out in the system and know each other. And I've just been on Capitol Hill testifying on things, and I'm very worried about the ban. I have made very clear that I think that is un-American and dangerous. And second, about the money, because some of the programs really are being cut, and I think we will be very sorry for that. So I think it's very important for not just us to argue for the aspect of it, but just the point that you made. I hope that you make your views clear, and that maybe that's some message that can come out of here also, is that the ability for us to understand other countries can only come if we have exchanges and work together and learn each other's language.
Yeah, absolutely true.
Michael Linden, I just wanted to ask, what is the one thing that you would recommend that every individual person in this room should do after leaving this conference?
Well, I tell you what I think. The one thing actually is to, first of all, do I only have one thing? Okay. No. I mean, I think stay in touch is a very important part. I am a dot connector, and networking, I think, is very important. And to decide that this isn't just a one-off, that you are going to stay in touch. And also, as people travel, is always to make sure that you actually see X person again, and keep track of what the things are that are being done, and then talk about them back. You know, we have to be megaphones for each other in terms of talking about. I think that staying in touch is the one thing, because it's easy to say, okay, I had a great time in Abu Dhabi, see you sometime. But I think that there needs to be a real determination to stay in touch.
And by the way, that's part of the plan, right?
Yeah.
In fact, the idea of building a web-based collaborative platform has always been part of what we're talking about here to enable people to stay in touch. I think you had a question, yes? We've got about 5 more minutes.
Madam Secretary, thank you for your service. My name is Doug Hickey. I proudly served in the Obama administration. My question is, what do you think the state of America is today?
Okay, you have 30 seconds.
The truth is, I think we're very confused at the moment. Obviously, the election turned out differently than I wanted it to, and many others. But I think that it is a time that we need to ask ourselves questions about how we missed the story. What is it that really had happened in the United States, and why certain people were ignored in various aspects. So I'm worried. But what worries me also is I obviously do a lot of international travel, and we have managed to confuse the rest of the world. And I have gone from official meetings to unofficial meetings, wherever, and people say, can you tell me, they ask this question, what is going on? What is the role that you're going to play? Fine for a lot of good words to be spoken, but what are the actions? And so that is what makes me very nervous, is that we have confused the world. And I do believe, I have believed this all along, that we are the indispensable nation, but there is nothing about the word indispensable that says alone, is we need to be part of a larger community. And so I'm very worried about how we look to ourselves and how we look to the rest of the world, I think. And that, which is another part, I think that we can use a meeting like this to have informal contacts and say we haven't lost our minds. Some have, but we haven't. But I am worried, because it's not, when we came to the United States, which is in 1948, we really, my father used to say that we really never been to such a middle-class country where people related to each other so well. And I have to say this, that when we were in England during the war, people were very kind to us. We were refugees. And people would say, we're so sorry your country's been taken over by a terrible dictator. You're welcome here. What can we do to help you? And when are you going home? And when we came to the United States, people would say, we're so sorry your country's been taken over by the communists. You're welcome here. What can we do to help you? And when will you become a citizen? And that is what has changed in so many ways. And America has been welcoming, and it has made other countries more welcoming, I would have hoped. But I really do think that some of the bans and things that we are talking about it's very hard for us to tell the Europeans to take more refugees if we're not doing it ourselves. And so I think that we have lost that kind of leadership capability, and it makes me very sad.
Lana Nusebi, the UAE ambassador to the United Nations, it's good to see you again.
Nice to see you.
Thank you very much for this really lucid talk. Just a follow-up comment to that question, and then a question of my own, if I might ask, on the word that Americans don't like very much, multilateralism. The follow-up point is, how do you reconcile that there is a difficult period, of course, domestically and internationally with this administration's policies, with the fact that for many of us in the region, of course, there's much more clarity on some of our core issues. So we're seeing much more bilateral cooperation on key issues that are challenges to us in the region, whereas in the previous administration, we did feel a little bit of a disengagement in terms of the challenges we face in terms of regional interference, the issue of terrorism, the rise of extremism. That all comes into the cultural diplomacy wing as well, I think. On the question of multilateralism, you described very eloquently the populist trends around the world that were causing loss of faith in domestic governments, but there's clearly also a loss of faith in institutions. The Bretton Woods structure that was created post-1945, the UN being one of them. And part of the reason that is described for that is, of course, that US ownership of those institutions, US prominence in those institutions, has not let some of the rising countries play the role that they would like to play. I can think of the Chinese Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank effort in 2005 as an attempt to counter that, and a number of other initiatives where I think rising countries want to play a more prominent role in these institutions. Is that one solution, in your view, in terms of making these institutions stronger? How do we reconnect through cultural diplomacy and other methods to these organizational structures, or are we going to be celebrating their demise in 2030?
Well, I hope not, but I do think the following thing. I have said that institutions and people 70 and over need refurbishing. And so I think that there does need to be some work done on the UN. I have been an admirer of the UN, but I think that it does need fixing, and the amount of time that has been spent on enlarging the Security Council or not and looking at various aspects. I do think that there are ways, and there's a great new Secretary General at the UN who has worked within the UN system, and I think really does believe it. I have been suggesting something, and I don't know whether this is possible or not, but the Trusteeship Council, when I was there, was put into what we call Sleeping Beauty condition. There are no trust territories, as is appropriate, but I do think there needs to be some part of the UN that, in fact, works with new states, fragile states, states in trouble, in terms of being helpful, not imposing any kind of will, but providing some help. The other part that I believe is that the world is now full of non-state actors who are also, people always think terrorists, but that's not, they're non-state actors that are multinational corporations and NGOs, and I think they should be at the table at the UN much earlier to be part of the discussion. And so I think that there are ways to fix the UN. You're at the UN, so I have to say the following thing. When I was there were 183 countries in the UN, and it was one of the first times that I didn't have to fix lunch myself. So I asked my assistant to invite the women permanent representatives. There were 6, and it was Canada, Philippines, Kazakhstan, Trinidad, Tobago, Jamaica, and Liechtenstein. So I was the American, so I had to form the caucus. We called ourselves the G7. And what we did was to lobby for women judges on the War Crimes Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, since most of the crimes have been committed against women. We managed to do that. But the UN, I think, has wider representation now in women, and I do think that something has to be done, but it's not simple. And redoing major institutions is one of those cliches. If it didn't exist, we'd create it. But the bottom line, it does need work on it. And I think, and one of the things, to go back on the cuts, that bothers me is this administration is thinking about cutting its contributions to the UN, especially to the peacekeeping operations and the voluntary organizations, which is really counterproductive in every single way.
Ladies and gentlemen.
Well, David, I have to tell my story of what is expected of a Secretary of State that I hadn't thought, if I might.
Ladies
When I
and
first
gentlemen,
became-
Madeleine has to tell her story
Okay.
of what is
Because-
expected of a
Because
secretary.
it is a music story. So what happened when I got to be Secretary of State, I'm told that I had to go to the ASEAN Regional Forum, which I was happy to go to, but that the custom always was that the last night, every country did a skit, and the United States was really bad. So I'm
I'm
going
sorry,
there,
I should have
and
brought this up, yeah.
my staff says, yeah, we get given you lyrics to Mary Had a Little Lamb, and I said, I am not doing that. And it was a year that I actually hadn't wanted to go because Burma had been brought in, and they had a military dictatorship. But I did go, and so on the way over, with my staff, we decided that I would sing Don't Cry for Me, ASEANis. So I got dressed up as Madonna, and the delegation was the background, and I managed to do that, and everybody was quite surprised. So then that year, the Russian skit was Yevgeny Primakov. All he did was have a whistle, and his delegation was the Black Sea Fleet, and that was kind of lame. So we decided that on the next time that we would do a duet. So on the margins of really important meetings, we decided that we would do our version of the West Side Story. So it was called the East-West Story, and we made up the lyrics, and that year the thing was in Manila, and we went to General MacArthur's suite at the hotel. The Russians brought a lot of vodka, and we rehearsed, and the next day our delegations had a rumble, and then I came out singing Yevgeny, Yevgeny, the most beautiful sound I ever heard. And he came out singing Madeleine Albright, Madeleine Albright. So that is cultural diplomacy. Yeah. Thank you.
One last thing here. What's your nickname?
Sticks.
Why is
Shall I
it
tell
Sticks?
you why?
Yeah, tell
because
us why
this
it's Sticks.
also is cultural diplomacy. The Obama administration was giving a dinner for the Chinese, a state dinner, and it had a lot of American music in it. And Chris Bodie, who plays the trumpet, was incredible. And then he went to the Kennedy Center, and I was with some people who said, well, you've got to go down and meet him before, because afterwards he'll be mobbed. So we went down to see him, and he said, sometimes when I have somebody in my audience that's well-known, I ask them if they would come and play drums with me. Would you do that? And I said, sure. I don't play the drums, but nevertheless, I went down, and I did play the drums at the Kennedy Center with Chris Bodie, and it was fantastic. I had a great time. And then what happened last night when I was talking about the Thelonious Monk Institute, their deal is that every year they feature some instrument in order to, for the students, and then to give an award. So that year they decided to do drums. And so they honored me, and Aretha Franklin sang Respect to Me, and then I played the drums again with Chris Bodie. And then I got my nickname Sticks. No, thank you.
Well, you certainly deserve that respect. I saw Deborah Rutter, the president of the Kennedy Center, here out of the corner of my eye. And I imagine an upcoming additional
An event.
an additional booking for
Yeah,
you,
great.
possibly later in the
Yeah.
future. Ladies and gentlemen, Madeleine Albright, an international treasure.
Congratulations.
Yes.
Yeah.